Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. In both our Old Testament and New Testament reading today, we have the justice of God coming to the foreground. In the book of Amos, we have the Lord speaking judgment against the surrounding nations that were around Israel and Judah, but also even words of judgment against Israel and Judah. And he talks about the fact that they are going to have a rough go at it when it comes to God's judgment and his punishment against these nations. But then also in the book of Revelation, we have in chapter 6, we have the various seals that are broken. And it too is a very unpleasant sight. We see the first seal bringing the rider on the white horse, but then it gets into the second seal with the war, the third seal with famine, the fourth seal with death, the fifth seal with the martyrs, the sixth seal with terror, and it goes on. And then when we get past that, then we'll even see 7 bowls of wrath. We'll see plagues that come on the earth. Chapter 6 through 19 is just a horrible picture of what the world will look like in this particular situation that is being described in the book of Revelation, which is commonly called the tribulation. And so even in the New Testament, we see God rendering justice against a world that had rejected his son and had mistreated his people. And so on both sides, we see the justice of God, which flies in the face of the common misperception that the God of the Old Testament is a grumpy, a mean God who is unloving, unfair, against the New Testament God who's full of love and mercy, and you can't do anything wrong that he won't forgive, and just this loving, grandfatherly type of God. And a lot of times the Old Testament is pitted against the New Testament, and people say, well, there's a contrast here between how God is described in the Old Testament and how he's described in the New Testament. But what we find is that, yeah, we see the justice of God in the Old Testament, but you know what? We see it in the New Testament. At the very beginning in the Gospels, Jesus himself speaks of Gehenna. He speaks of the flame that's never quenched, where the worm doesn't die. He talks about the outer darkness, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then, of course, as mentioned before, at the end of the book of the New Testament, or the end of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, you have immense judgment and justice being rendered on the earth. And so this should dispel any misperceptions someone might have, where you have God being described in one way in the Old Testament and being described in another in the New Testament. Which brings us to another topic of discussion we could have, and that is, what about this justice of God? You know, we all love talking about the mercy of God, the grace of God, and many of our worship hymns are about God's amazing grace and things along those lines. But you don't hear a whole lot of songs about God's justice, and people don't typically like to talk about God's justice all that much. And there's not really a high value placed on the justice of God in contrast to the love and mercy and grace of God. And oftentimes, if we're not careful in our minds, we think, well, justice is the bad part of God and mercy is the good part of God. We got to remember both are parts of a good and loving God. A good God is comprised of both justice and love. That makes God complete. And both of those things come together in the cross of Christ. So justice isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, justice always looks bad when you're the outsider looking in. You know, if you're ever in the grocery store and there's a parent there correcting the child, it always seems harsh if you're not involved in the situation. If you're just in the aisle next to them and all you hear is the parent getting onto the child, maybe being very stern with the child, and maybe it seems harsh, you know, because again, you're not part of the situation, and you kind of think, wow, that was a pretty harsh statement the parent made, or they sure are being tough on the child. But we got to remember, we're not in the situation. We haven't followed the parent from home to the grocery store, where there might have been a million different ways that the child was being rebellious and provoking the parent, and maybe it just all came to a head at the grocery store. Or we're also not perhaps the child's sibling whose hair got pulled or got slapped in the face inadvertently. Because we're not part of the situation, we're just outsiders looking in. All we see and hear is that the parent is getting onto the child, and it seems a bit distasteful and a little bit harsh on the parent's part. And I'm afraid we have that kind of attitude when we come to the Old Testament scriptures, especially like in the book of Amos that we're reading today. We think, wow, God sure is being harsh on these nations. He sure is being cruel in the way that he's dealing with these nations. And on the outside, looking in, we think, how is it that God could destroy these nations? And in some of the ways that it's described in this judgment that's coming upon them, it seems very, very harsh. But again, we're outside the situation looking in. And therefore, we're not really in a position to make a good judgment about how God is rendering his justice. Think about it in this situation. I mean, perhaps it could be, we could be some of the people living in that particular in those societies, and have been actually victims of the gross activities that had been going on there. Then perhaps we wouldn't feel so bad about the justice of God. In Amos chapter 2, in verse 6, he gives some description of what was going on in Israel among his own people. He says, "For 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because they sell the righteous for money." So they're selling people who are living godly lives and just selling them to make a profit. "And the needy for a pair of sandals." Just to get a pair of sandals, they'll sell a human being. We know how bad that is, because that hits close to home where we sold people into slavery. And we've come to realize that, the value of a human life is a lot more precious than that. And a human is not to be sold. But they were doing that. We talk about human trafficking in our day and age, and that's similar to what was going on there. He says in verse 7, "Those who pant after the dust of the earth on the head of the helpless also turn aside the way of the humble. And a man and his father resort to the same girl." A father and a son, both having sex with the same girl, in order to profane my holy name. "On garments taken as pledges," that is, somebody gives them a pledge. Well, they take that garment and they stretch out beside every altar. "And in the house of their God, they drink the wine of those who have been fined." These are atrocious things that were going on in Israel. And if you were a victim of those things, maybe perhaps you were the girl who was being mistreated sexually by the father and the son. Or maybe it was your sister or your daughter who was having to deal with that situation. You better bet you would be wanting some justice, and rightfully so. Justice always looks bad on the outside, but when it's you that needs justice, when it's us that need justice, then justice doesn't look quite so bad. If someone does something against us that's harmful, that's destructive, we want justice. We want something to happen in order to justify or to bring to justification that situation. Either the person gets put in jail, or there's some type of monetary restitution made. But we want justice when something is done to us. But when it's not done to us, and we just observe it on the outside, and we see justice, sometimes it looks harsh and it looks really, really bad. And so we just have to be careful when we read Old Testament scriptures that's talking about events that took place 2,500 years ago, or even up to 4,000 years ago. And we just think, wow, that's very harsh. Just keep in mind that we are not in that particular situation. And so God's justice is actually a good thing. If you're a victim, justice is a wonderful thing. If you're the one being abused, if you're the one that's being mistreated. And so we shouldn't ever think about God's justice as the bad part of God and God's love as the good part of God. It all makes up God. But what we can be thankful for is that, yes, God is just, and he does render out justice. But for those who have a humble heart, and for those who feel really bad for what they've done, for those who want a change of ways and has a change of heart, there is a way to avert God's justice through Jesus Christ, who died on the cross for our sins. But there is not just a get out of jail free card. It also asks us of something. When we give our lives to Christ, what do? We put to death the old self. And so the old self is still brought under justice in that, as Romans chapter 6 talks about, we are buried with him in baptism. The old self is crucified with him, and we're raised to walk in newness of life. And so the old self who committed those things is to be put to death, justice rendered on that old person, but then we turn a face anew to God to walk according to the new life that is found in Jesus Christ. And so God can be just and also the justifier of him who has faith in Jesus Christ, as Paul talks about in the book of Romans. So as we do our reading today, there's a lot of justice. There's a lot of harsh words. There's a lot of difficult things that are going to be going on. But let's just remember that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. That this is a part of who God is, and he's going to exercise that according to his wisdom and according to his knowledge and according to his ability to see the whole situation thoroughly, whereas we don't have that complete knowledge ourselves. So with that, guys, these are some things to reflect on. With that, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.